Here in Ireland we like to talk about history, but we have a talent for understatement. We call World War II the emergency, we call 30 years of violence the Troubles, and that time a hurricane struck Ireland in 1839, killing hundreds of people. We refer to it as the Night of the Big Wind. And that's the topic of this little talk that I'm going to give you here today. This is based on a talk I gave here in Kilbeggan Library on Tuesday, November 7th, a couple of weeks ago. My name is Manus and I work here at Kilbeggan Library. I'm going to start talking about the Night of the Big Wind generally across Ireland, and then I'm going to move on to its impact specifically right here in Kilbeggan, which we have graphic details on because there was a journalist here in town that night. So, the Night of the Big Wind was a storm which blew across Ireland on the night of January 6, 1839. Let's place that in history. If you were 40 that night, you would remember Napoleon being current affairs when you were a kid. You would remember the abolition of slavery in Britain a few years earlier. Slavery was still in force in America. The Qing dynasty was in power in China. There were no real railways yet. There was a few in Britain. Telephones, telegraphs were unheard of, so communications were much more primitive. This is 6 years before the famine. I don't want to get too much into the meteorological causes of the disaster, but suffice it to say that an extremely warm front collided with an Atlantic depression, causing strange weather conditions in Ireland. On January the 5th, there was heavy snowfall. On January 6th, the snowfall melted in unseasonal sunny weather. It was also eerily calm. You could put a candle outside and it wouldn't blow out. So it was an odd day, and people would have known that something was up. Sure enough, by 6 o'clock, the weathercocks were spinning around in the high winds. Doors were slamming and opening. 10 p.m. Pitch darkness. This is 1839. No electricity. The only light is from candles, fires, and lanterns. And in this pitch darkness, a high wind blows across Ireland, lasting for several hours. On the west coast, the cliffs of Moher are topped by waves, so heavy is the wind. In one part of the west coast, quote, the sea rose to such a height that the poor inhabitants thought it was the end of the world. And traditionally, the end of the world was supposed to come on Mulligan Man, which is January 6th. An old soldier pulled from the wreckage of his house said, well, I have heard of the burning of Moscow, and I was at the Battle of Badajoz, but dang me if this does not beat them hollow. There was massive destruction all across the country. Whole forests were stripped of leaves, others were blown down. Millions of wild birds were killed as their habitats were destroyed. Wooden cabins and thatched roofs were blown away. A strange side effect was fire. People had to desert their houses very rapidly as the thatch came falling in on top of them. They left fires lit, which then caught. But, dangerous and all as it was on land, it was far worse to be caught on sea on that night. 30 people aboard the packet steamer Pennsylvania, having just sailed from the US, were killed when their ship went down. Another 120 lost their lives when the storm carried on across the Irish Sea and raged into Liverpool. The Dublin Evening Mail described Dublin as a sacked city. Quote, houses burning, others unroofed as if by storm of shot and shell, a few levelled with the ground, with all their furniture within, while the rattling of engines, cries of firemen and labourers of the military present the very real aspect and mimicry of war. So it was as if a war had passed over Dublin. So great was the destruction. Moving on now to events in Kilbeggan. People were very interested in hearing about how this disaster affected the places very familiar to them. And you can come into the library and look at our newspaper archives, and you can find out how this storm affected your local town or area. Quote, it was almost impossible for anyone to venture into the streets from the danger of slates that were flying in all directions. A policeman who ventured out with his cloak about him was absolutely lifted by the wind nearly as high as the eave stones of the houses, and he fell with so much force upon the street that he has been since throwing up blood, and he's at present in a very bad way. At 2 o'clock, the roof of a thatched house in the Moat Road, from which the inhabitants had fled, fell in and caught fire. The blaze immediately communicated with the houses adjoining, and in a few moments the whole range was on fire. The scene that followed was terrible beyond description. The inhabitants fled, some of them naked, into the fields, leaving all their little property behind. In less than an hour, 12 houses and everything in them were consumed. There's a theory as to why this happened on the Moat Road and why fire did not spread closer to the middle of town. The theory is that the sheer bulk of Locke's distillery sheltered the town from a part of the wind. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is notable that the only fire happened on the far side of Locke's. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, where the canal lies, what appeared to be the most astonishing effect of the storm was the blowing of the water out of the canal near this town. I visited it this morning and it was nearly dry. And according to the Irish Times, the same thing happened in Tuam, i.e. the water was blown straight out of the canal. But weirdly enough, on other waterways the opposite happened. Due to melting snow and the force of the wind, the distillery wheel was broken by the force of a sudden rush of water. Down near the canal, quote, a slate struck a large gate post and nearly cut it across. This post was 157 yards from the roof of the building from whence it had been blown by the wind. Those who saw it were lost in astonishment, and the people here have agreed to place it on the top of a monument. That is pretty amazing, but unfortunately no such monument exists in Kilbeggan today. They didn't follow through on their plans, apparently. And our journalist who was in Kilbeggan that night, a correspondent for the Athlone Sentinel, tells us that he has just received accounts from Moat and Tullamore, and you can imagine him writing his dispatches in the heat of the moment. Quote, I have been told that in the former town, in Moat, 65 houses have been burnt. The horror and desolation that prevail are beyond the powers of description. The public coaches have been stopped owing to large trees which have been blown across the road between this and Galway. And the roads between Dublin and Kilbeggan also were impassable. So you couldn't travel east or west. The roads were completely blocked by trees blown down. So even though the storm was over, people were basically cut off from all communication. No telegraph, no electronic communication. People have just witnessed what happened outside their own front doors, and they only have to leave it to their own imaginations to think about what's happening in other parts of the country. It'll be days before they start receiving reports. An interesting question that I want to pose is whether the death toll reported from this event is accurate. It's given as 300, 200 to 300 across all of Ireland. However, we know that 120 died in Liverpool at the tail end of the storm. We know that there were many fisher people drowned, and we know that in the extreme ferocity of the storm, many people must have been harmed. So it's very hard to say. Maybe a lot of poorer people were not counted due to the callousness of the authorities, perhaps, or due to poor communications. On the other hand, it was clear from the day that the weather was strange. People might have had time to take precautions that might have saved a lot of lives. So the jury's out on whether the death toll is accurate or not. A final word from our correspondent here for the Athlone Sentinel, who was caught in Kilbeggan on the night of the big wind. He was staying in a hotel called Sheridan's, and he was on the top floor. The windows were all blown in by the force of the storm, and he was worried that so much wind would get in those windows that it would lift the top floor of the hotel off. Certainly such things had happened in other parts of the country. The spires of churches, big solid buildings, were blown down. So he was not wrong to fear this. Thankfully, the staff at the hotel acted quickly, grabbed a load of mattresses and blocked up the windows with the mattresses, saving the building from being torn to pieces. Which shows how even in these most horrible of times, people come together and help one another. Thanks for listening, and I hope this little talk has left you more well informed about the night of the big wind, January 6th, 1839. Stay tuned for other talks on local history, which I'll be recording here in Kilbeggan Library. Slán live.